Imagine waking up one morning, checking your phone, and discovering that you are worth $1 billion. Not metaphorically, not in some motivational poster sense. On paper, in legally documented form, confirmed by accountants and lawyers, you are a billionaire. Your startup just closed a funding round. Investors signed the paperwork. Your family is calling. Your friends are celebrating. The number is right there on the screen. Undeniable, official, real. But before you say a word, here is what Ray Dalio would want you to ask yourself. And this matters because Dalio is not just another face on a financial television program. He's the man who built Bridgewater Associates from a two-bedroom New York City apartment into the largest hedge fund on the planet, managing over $150 billion at its peak. He is the man who called the 2008 financial crisis while most of Wall Street was still popping champagne. He correctly navigated the dot-com collapse, the 1987 crash, the Latin American debt crisis, and every major market cycle of the last 50 years. His firm has survived and profited through conditions that destroyed institutions with far more resources and far longer histories. When Ray Dalio asks a financial question, the smartest people in any room stop talking and start listening. His question is this: can you actually spend any of it? Not by calling your banker and waiting 3 business days, not by issuing new shares, not by borrowing against the valuation. Right now, tonight, if you needed to pay rent, cover an emergency, or put food on the table, can you reach into your $1 billion wealth and pull out a single dollar? In most cases, the honest answer is no, and that single uncomfortable answer is the foundation of the most important financial insight Dalio has spent 50 years trying to communicate to the world. Wealth and money are not the same thing. They look identical when markets are rising. They feel identical, but they operate on completely different rules. And the gap between them right now, at this exact moment in history, is larger than it has been at any point since the summer of 1929. That statement is not an opinion. It is a measurement. And by the end of this video, you are going to see your own financial life very differently because of it. To understand why this distinction matters so deeply, you need to meet someone. His name is not important. Call him Michael. In the spring of 1999, Michael was a 32-year-old software engineer living in San Jose, California. He was not rich by any measure. He had a decent salary, a modest apartment, and a brokerage account he had opened 2 years earlier with $10,000 of carefully saved money. Not gambling money, not money he could afford to lose. Money he had set aside slowly, deliberately, with real sacrifice, skipping vacations, driving an older car, cooking at home most nights. By early 2000, that account had grown to $140,000. In less than 2 years, everything he owned had multiplied 14 times. He felt untouchable. He felt like he had finally figured out what most people spend their whole lives missing. He started telling friends about the positions he held. He started reading the financial news with the quiet confidence of someone who understood things that others did not. He called his mother and told her not to worry about money anymore. He began drawing up a real plan, a down payment on a house by summer, retirement by 45, maybe a small business eventually. The future had never looked so clear. Michael was not reckless. He was not gambling. He bought shares in technology companies that the most credentialed analysts on Wall Street were recommending without hesitation. He followed the advice of professionals who had track records, reputations, and polished offices. And on paper, he was genuinely, officially wealthy. His net worth statement confirmed it. His bank confirmed it. Every piece of financial information available to him confirmed it. By December of that same year, his account was worth $11,000. $140,000 of wealth had not moved to someone else's account. It had not been stolen or transferred or lost in a single catastrophic trade. It had simply ceased to exist because it had never truly existed in the first place. It had been a number on a screen that depended entirely on other people being willing to pay that same number. The moment enough of those people needed actual money, not paper wealth, not valuations, but real spendable cash to meet real obligations, the number collapsed with a speed that Michael had never imagined possible. He had done everything right by the information available to him. He had been careful. patient and informed, and it still happened because his wealth was real when nobody needed money. It evaporated the instant they did. This is precisely the distinction Dalio has spent decades explaining. Wealth can be created almost infinitely on paper. Money cannot. And every single time the gap between those two things grows wide enough, the correction back to reality is brutal, swift, and indifferent to who you are or how carefully you made your decisions. Here is the mechanics of it, stripped to its simplest form. Think of a small town where everyone agrees that a particular painting is worth $1 million. The owner of that painting is, by every official measure, a millionaire. They feel wealthy. Their bank might even lend against it. But if the whole town needed cash at once, if everyone tried to sell their valuable things simultaneously, what happens to the price of the painting? It collapses. Not because the painting got uglier, not because anything changed about the object itself, but because price is not a property of the thing being sold. Price is a property of the relationship between buyers and sellers. When sellers outnumber buyers, wealth does not transfer somewhere else. It stops existing. That is not a metaphor. That is the mechanical reality of how every major financial collapse in recorded history has unfolded. This is what happened to Michael. It is what happened in 1929, when the American stock market lost nearly 90% of its value over 3 years, turning what had looked like permanent and widely shared prosperity into breadlines and shuttered factories within a single generation. People who had considered themselves comfortably set for life, not speculators, not reckless gamblers, but ordinary middle-class investors who had followed the conventional wisdom of their era, discovered that the security they had built was a perception more than a possession. The conditions that preceded both of those moments look by Dalio's measurements almost exactly like the conditions of right now. Here is something worth genuinely sitting with for a moment, and I want you to actually do this rather than just passively listen. Think about your own investments or your parents or anyone close to you who has been in the market for the last several years. How much of that wealth could actually be spent tomorrow? Not liquidated carefully over 3 months in a stable market. Spent tonight if you had to. That number is almost certainly much smaller than the total on the statement. And the difference between those two figures is exactly what Dalio has been measuring and warning about. Hold that gap in your mind as we go through the rest of this, because by the time this video ends, that question is going to look very different than it does right now. Dalio calls it the wealth to money ratio. And currently in the United States, that ratio sits somewhere between 8 to 1 and 12 to 1 across the broader economy. In the stock market specifically, it is approximately 3 to 1, meaning for every single dollar of real spendable money beneath the market, there are $3 of paper equity wealth resting on top of it. If those numbers feel abstract, here's what makes them concrete. Those are the same readings from 1929 and the peak of the dot-com boom in the year 2000. Not approximately. Not in the same rough neighborhood, the same levels. And in both of those cases, what followed was not a gentle correction. It was a collapse that wiped out decades of accumulated wealth in months. In both of those previous moments, the crash came organically. A slow shift in confidence, a spreading doubt. Nobody sent a bill. The market simply lost faith. But today, Dalio is watching something different. Something that would not require a mood shift at all. Something that could arrive in the form of a policy announcement. That trigger is the wealth tax. Here's why this is so mechanically dangerous in today's specific environment. The wealth gap across most developed economies has reached levels that are politically impossible to ignore. A very small share of the population controls a disproportionate share of total assets. And this is not an observation from one side of the political debate. It is a mathematical reality that governments across the ideological spectrum are being pushed by their voters to address. The answer gaining the most momentum in policy circles across multiple countries simultaneously is a direct annual tax on accumulated wealth. 2% of net worth above a certain threshold, 3%. Whatever the specific number ends up being, the logic sounds airtight. Tax the wealthy, fund public services, reduce inequality. But here is the mechanical problem that almost nobody in that political conversation is willing to engage with. Honestly, the overwhelming majority of wealth is not held in cash. It lives in stocks, in private equity stakes, in real estate, in long-term illiquid investments that were never designed to be liquidated quickly. To pay a wealth tax, you must sell assets. You must convert paper wealth into actual money. And when a government sends that bill to 1 million wealthy investors at roughly the same time, all of them needing to liquidate assets to pay it, the synchronized selling pressure in a market where the wealth-to-money ratio is already at historic extremes could trigger exactly the repricing that the ratio has been warning about. A policy designed to redistribute wealth could end up destroying it instead. And here's the part that never gets discussed. The people hurt most would not primarily be the ultra-wealthy, who have teams of sophisticated advisors helping them navigate any policy environment. It would be the ordinary investors, the teachers and engineers and small business owners who have spent 20 years building retirement accounts and finally feel like they have something real, only to discover that their wealth was far more fragile than they understood. The very people the policy was designed to help could end up bearing the most damage. This is not a theoretical risk sitting comfortably in the distant future. Multiple countries are actively debating wealth tax legislation right now. The political pressure behind it is not going away. If anything, it is building. And the market is sitting at a ratio that is historically needed very little additional pressure to begin repricing sharply downward. So what does this actually mean for a person trying to build and protect a financial life in this environment? Because warnings without practical implications are just anxiety dressed up as wisdom. The first shift is conceptual, and it is more important than any tactical move you could make. You have to genuinely internalize the difference between your net worth number and your real wealth. The figure on your brokerage statement is not what you own. It is what the current market agrees your assets are worth. Those are not the same thing. One is permanent. The other is conditional on an agreement that can break at any time and for reasons that have nothing to do with your individual decisions or the quality of the choices you made. This is the foundational reason Dalio has held gold consistently for decades. Not out of nostalgia. Not because he distrusts modern finance, because gold is the only major financial asset that carries no counterparty. When you own gold, no company needs to remain solvent for it to retain its value. No government can print more of it. No central bank can devalue it with a policy decision. No CEO can destroy half of it with a single bad acquisition. It simply exists, and has been recognized as a storehold of value across every civilization in recorded human history, from ancient Egypt to the Silk Road to the modern financial system. That consistency across thousands of years and hundreds of collapsed currencies is not superstition. It is the most rigorous possible stress test of what actually holds value when systems break. Notice also what central banks around the world have been doing quietly over the last several years. The institutions that understand money most deeply, that exist specifically to manage the relationship between money, credit, and value, are accumulating gold at the fastest rate in more than 50 years. They are not making dramatic announcements about it. They are simply buying. When the people who print money are using that money to buy something that cannot be printed, that tells you something significant about what people with the deepest understanding of the current system actually believe about its future. Gold's long-term real return is approximately 1.2% per year above inflation. That is low. It is not the kind of number that makes you rich quickly or generates excitement at dinner parties, but that is not what gold is for. Gold is the floor, the portion of a portfolio that does not require anyone's agreement, promise, or continued solvency to hold its value. When paper wealth reprices violently, as it has in every major crisis of the last 100 years, gold tends to hold. Sometimes it rises sharply while everything else falls. Dalio keeps roughly 10% of his own portfolio in gold and suggests most investors maintain somewhere between 5 and 15% in gold or comparable hard assets depending on their broader financial situation. But here is the deeper principle underneath all of this, the one that changes how you see not just gold, but your entire financial picture. It comes down to understanding what credit actually is. And the way most people think about this reveals exactly how exposed they are without realizing it. When a bank gives you a mortgage, it does not carry a suitcase full of physical currency to your closing. It creates credit, a promise of money. You use that promise to buy your house. The credit is indistinguishable from money in the transaction. It does the same job. It clears the same obligations in the moment. But it is not money. It is an obligation. Specifically, your obligation to deliver real money back to the bank over time. This distinction matters enormously because credit can be created in almost unlimited quantities. Banks can issue far more credit than they hold in actual reserves. Governments can actively encourage this process through policy. And every unit of credit created genuinely adds purchasing power to the economy in the short term. It drives up prices, creates the feeling of widespread prosperity, and fuels what looks like real growth. But every unit of credit also creates a corresponding obligation that must eventually be settled in real money, not in more credit, not in paper wealth, in actual spendable money. And when the total debt across an entire economy grows much faster than the actual money available to service it, the system accumulates a fragility that is completely invisible during calm periods and devastating the moment it is tested. Think about Michael again. He did not understand any of this in 1999. He saw a number growing on a screen and called it wealth. He built a real-life plan around that number. He measured his security, his future, and his self-worth by that number. And when the number turned out to represent something far more conditional than he had understood, the plan dissolved faster than he could process what was happening. He was not foolish. He was not uninformed by the standards of that time. He was simply working with a definition of wealth that excluded the most important variable, the variable that separates the number you were told you have from what you actually own when it counts. The people who navigated the crashes of 2000 and 2008 successfully, the ones who did not merely survive but emerged with their foundations intact, were not the ones who predicted the exact timing. Nobody does that reliably, and anyone claiming otherwise is selling something. They were the ones who had asked before the storm arrived how much of what they called wealth was real. They had already built some meaningful portion of their financial life on assets that did not require the current agreement to hold. And when the agreement broke, they had a floor beneath them that others did not. Here's the sentence that summarizes everything. The one idea Dalio returns to again and again across 50 years of thinking about money and financial systems: wealth is what survives the moment when everyone needs cash at once, not the number on the statement, not the valuation in the funding round, not the account balance that looks exceptional on a Tuesday and could look unrecognizable by the following Friday. Wealth is what survives the test. Paper is what disappears when the test arrives. And right now, by Dalio's own measured analysis, the distance between those two things has not been this wide in living memory. The wealth-to-money ratio is at historic extremes. The political environment is generating real pressure toward policies that could force synchronized liquidation across markets. The credit cycle is at a point where the obligations underneath the system have grown faster than the money available to service them. And most people looking at their statements feel exactly the way Michael felt in early 2000, like they have finally figured it out, like the growth is permanent and the security is real. That feeling is not wrong. The growth is real. The progress is real. The progress is real. But there is a question worth asking honestly before the question gets asked for you. How much of what you have would survive the moment when enough people need money at once? Drop a comment below, because the answer most people come up with when they genuinely stop to think about it tends to be much smaller than the number on their statement. And knowing the difference before it matters might be the most valuable thing you take from any financial content you watch this year.